you're going from a data set where you have between 1,500 and 3,000 to close to 4 million. So it's a way, way richer data set using things like top speed, distance run to help inform what the player can actually provide us tactically, and vice versa, use the tactical to kind of inform what are the physical demands of this game going to be. We can now assign that using tracking data. We can assign that a value between 0 and 1 or whatever pressing scale you want to use. We can identify that that's a very different type of pressure than just you coming towards me when I have the ball. And I would say like, oh yeah, I'll have that to you in like 20 minutes. And they'd be amazed, like, oh my God, that's incredible. Like, this is such good work. How are you able to do this so quickly? And then they'll ask for some other feature request, and I'm like, that's like 5 months of work right there. That's one thing I felt like we did really well at Miami is when we did make recruitment decisions, it really felt like a team decision. Trying to work on your football knowledge and work with people who are in football will definitely help you. Analytics is kind of one of the only major departments on the sporting side that actually has zero decision-making power on its own. I would say like the number one thing is you need to like understand a coding language and start to build out in that coding language. So that would be
Hello and welcome back to the Chris Gill podcast, and today's guest is Sam Gregory. So Sam has been involved in sports analytics for quite some time and has a really great journey in terms of his career so far to date. So he's currently the Director of Analytics at US Soccer, so an absolutely fantastic job to hold. He's quite new into that role and so currently building out a department there. Prior to that, he was the Director of Analytics at Inter Miami. So again, another really cool role. And he's also spent time at different tech and data companies as well. So really interesting conversation. So before we do get into that, I want to quickly ask you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. It really does help the channel to grow. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation with Sam Gregory. Sam, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me on, Chris.
Yeah, no, it's a real pleasure to have you on. Looking forward to chatting. And I think it was last week or so I put a post out on LinkedIn to let people know that I was recording an episode with you. And I think there's a lot of people that are interested to hear from you because I did get a lot of people get in touch, asking questions and putting questions forward. So that was good. So yeah, there's obviously lots to talk about. So what I will do first off, Sam, like I usually do, I'll pass it over to you. Just for those that don't know who you are or maybe a bit less familiar with your journey to where you are today, if you can just give a quick overview on that, please, Sam.
Yeah, of course. So currently I'm the Director of Data Analytics at US Soccer. So this is a role that goes across all of our national teams. So men's and women's senior teams, but we also have 16 youth teams, and we have our extended national teams, which are things like our cerebral palsy team, power team, futsal, beach soccer, all of the kind of different variations of the sport. So yeah, my role is across all of them and using data to kind of support where necessary. Before I was at US Soccer, I spent 3.5 years as the Director of Analytics at Inter Miami in MLS. And before that, I was at a club in the Canadian Premier League called, at the time it was called York 9, now it's York United.
Yeah.
And I've spent a couple of years in the industry at various tech companies. So I was at Okta, which is now Stats Perform,
Yeah.
and Project.
Yeah, perfect. So, and one other episode which might get kind of brought up in this conversation was with a friend of yours, Tom Warville, who I think you kind of had a lot of kind of goings on in terms of sharing ideas right at the start, blogging together, and also kind of co-founded Analytics FC. So I will link that down below for people to see if they haven't seen that already in terms of that kind of journey with Analytics FC and the blogging, etc. So I want to quickly jump to, first off, Sam, just right at the beginning in terms of, because a lot of times I do get asked about, do I need a degree to get into sports analytics? What degree? I come from a non-sporting background. Is that okay? So just to jump on that in terms of your education, so you've got an undergrad which wasn't in sport, so that was more, you also come from the economics background, is that correct?
Yeah, economics as well, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. And then you've also then got 2 masters, is that right? One's
Yeah.
not in for you, Sam, so you've got 2 masters. So in terms of then, when did your transition kind of come about for you to want to focus your skills and knowledge on football analytics? Because obviously we heard it from Tom, and Tom mentioned that he kind of, you two shared ideas, and not just you two, there's other people in the community. So I'm just curious to ask a little bit more about how that came about from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, my story is probably pretty similar to Tom and a bunch of us that were kind of coming through at that same time around like the like early 2010s. So I graduated from my undergrad in 2015. So I was doing economics, and at the time, like I still am interested in economics. I think it's like an interesting field, but really where my passion lied was in football and soccer, and I was doing courses in mathematics and statistics and like all of these areas. and I had this interest in sport.
Mm.
And I think like a lot of people, I read Moneyball and something sort of clicked where I was like, okay, I like baseball, but I've never been like the biggest baseball fan in the world. Whereas like growing up, I always loved soccer. And so I started delving into well, what wasn't really an online community yet was just like the start of an online community at the time. So there was maybe like 5 or 10 people who were writing regular blogs using data and data to analyze soccer. A lot of those blogs don't exist anymore. But I was just curious about what was out there. So I started writing a bit personally myself. But it was more like I have this skill set where I'm good with data. My math background is pretty strong, and I have this interest. What is kind of the connection between these two? And at the time, like soccer analytics was a super young field, and it was just sort of starting to get going. Only a couple clubs actually had people doing this work full time. And so it really started as just, okay, what is the way to like bring these two together? And then I went and did my master's in economics in the UK. And when I was in the UK, it just sort of opened up a bunch of other avenues because I was surrounded by a lot more high level professional clubs than I was in doing my undergrad in Canada. So that was like a big step. And that was where I'd been working with Tom for a while before then. We had actually started the podcast while I was still living in Canada and
Yeah.
he was in the UK. And we were just in this similar boat that I think a lot of people were at that time, that we were like university students really interested in this area. And the jobs were just starting to come, but they weren't really there. And I think we all kind of got lucky just in terms of timing that we didn't have experience in this field other than just doing it as a hobby,
Mm.
but there was no one else really doing it even as a hobby at that point. And so we kind of got opportunities to break through.
Yeah, cool. So, do you have any advice then, Sam, really on, because there'll be people in that are obviously now that are very similar to what you were back then in terms of maybe they are doing the blogging, they're doing things like that, but they want to maybe reach out like you did with Tom and other people. You built a kind of online community that, I think that can be a hard step for someone that may not know how to approach people, how to make them connections, because, it can be
Mhm.
quite a lonely place if you're kind of doing all this work on your own. So, can you remember how that came about? Did you message Tom? Did Tom message you? How were you kind of interacting with people at the time?
Yeah, I mean, it was all over Twitter at the time, which I mean, I think Twitter is a very different space in 2024 than it was in like 2013, 2014 when we were starting to do this work.
Yeah.
And so it was, I mean, I think it was Tom who actually wrote a blog post that referenced something that I had written.
Mm.
And we reached out. I can't even remember who reached out first, but we started talking. And again, this community was so much smaller back then. So the idea was that if you saw someone who referenced something you write, was like, oh, well, I should know who this person is.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we started talking and we found out that we had like very similar kind of goals in the industry and things we wanted to do and similar backgrounds and that we were both doing economics at the time.
Mm.
I think like I think there's a lot of sort of you think that the incentive should be like always to, okay, this person has a job that I want. Let me reach out to them. And I'll be honest, I get like probably like 20, 30 LinkedIn DMs a week of people saying, can we sit down for like a 15-minute chat just to go through some career advice? And I would love if I had time to go through that, but I wouldn't be able to do my job if I was doing that full time. And so I do think there's something to be said about instead of reaching out to the person that has a job that you really want, reaching out to people who are doing the same work as you and kind of figuring out what's the feedback you can get on your work. Are there ways that we can collaborate? And as you said, like it can be kind of lonely or just not as challenging an environment. If you're just working by yourself,
Yeah.
maybe you'll put something out, you'll get 1 or 2 comments on it. But I think if you're working in more of a collaborative environment, you'll grow a lot more. So I would recommend definitely like reaching out to people who are also in this field and who want to break through in this field. Um, One thing that exists a lot now, which didn't exist when I was coming through, was that in universities and colleges, there's like groups that do this now. So
Mm.
I know like a lot of colleges in the US have sporting analytics groups. And sometime this is probably a difference between the UK and the US is like college sports are a
Yeah.
big thing here. So often the sporting analytics groups at colleges here in the US will actually support their college teams. So they'll work with like, I know at US Soccer, we've hired a couple of people who have worked with their college soccer team and
Yeah.
have worked with those coaches, and that's given them the experience to make that jump to a full-time job.
Mm.
Uh, but I know, like in the UK, I'm sure there are plenty of opportunities where you can get together with people at your same university or just in like a kind of like local group and figure out what are things we can do together. Um, and then the other thing that I would recommend, which I know Tom recommended this on his podcast as well, but I think the temptation is always to write about like Premier League, Big
Yeah,
Six teams, Champions League teams. And if you're writing an article about like what you think Ten Hag should do this transfer window with Man United, you're going to be writing one of like
yeah,
30 pieces about what Ten Hag should do with Man United this window.
mm,
Whereas if you're writing about your like local League Two club, there's
mm,
probably not that many analytics pieces about that club. And so I think one, you're way more likely to for the person at that club to actually see and read it. And two, the fan base of that club is more likely to
yeah.
see it. So I think, yeah, the other piece of advice would be is like if there's a way to do it locally where you can actually interact with potentially the people who are making decisions at that club, that's probably a better way of going about it than just choosing X
Yeah.
like Big Six team in the Premier League that you support.
Yeah. Okay, so I hope you're enjoying the video so far, but I have a really quick interruption for anybody with an interest in video analysis. So if that's you, please do click the link down below the video for In Play Online. So just to give a quick overview, because I think it'll be relevant to a lot of people that are watching this particular video. So In Play Online is a cloud-based video analysis software. So it allows you to tag your videos, and when you've done your tagging, that includes adding labels, adding comments, adding notes and voice notes even, and you can even illustrate and draw over your clip. So if you are an aspiring analyst looking for your job and you want to create a portfolio of work, if you're a scout looking to make your kind of reports a little bit better and more animated, if you're a coach looking to get into analysis a little bit more, then this tool will be great for you because it starts at just £15 a month. So once you've done your analysis, you can add all the clips to different playlists which can be downloaded and exported offline. You can put them into presentations and also share them to different people within your team. So it comes with a whole bunch of other features, but I'll let you click the link down below if you are interested. As I say, packages start at just £15 a month, so it's a very affordable solution if you are looking for something to help with your video analysis. So that's it for the interruption. Let's get back to the video. Definitely. So obviously I'll link that down below, the one with Tom. Again, you mentioned the podcast that you had back then in terms of Analytics FC, and also I'll link the one with Jeremy Steele, who kind of it was also still involved with that to kind of see if people are interested to learn more about how that's kind of developed over the time. So in terms of then, just while we're still on the kind of advice a little bit, Sam, so obviously how important would you say if someone is wanting to work in football analytics in terms of like they've got the data skills, but about the actual football skills like watching? Because I think it came from I don't know which video it was, but I've seen a video where I think it might be the StatsBomb conference where you said at Miami you were able to go out and watch training and things like that, and that had a big impact on you. So how important is that for people to learn the actual game as well as the data skills?
Yeah, I think it's really important. And I think any way that you can sort of grow your knowledge of the game, understand like a lot of it just has to do with language, like using the same terminology that a coach would use. I think a lot of the language that we've invented in the like in the sport, not just in football, but in like
Yeah.
sports analytics in general, is sometimes like a completely different language than the language that coaches or sporting directors would use. And so trying to figure out how do I package this information? I found something interesting. How do I package this in a way that's more palatable is important.
Mm.
But I do think like we have a ton to learn. I mean, there's a ton that I'll see on like whether it's blogs or things that people write, where it's clear that the knowledge of the sport isn't there, and that can be a big barrier to kind of overcome. Um, in terms of like how to actually get better at that, I do think again that's something where there's a ton more resources now. There's courses online you can take on like performance analysis. I've never personally done coaching badges, but I know people who have done coaching badges.
Yeah.
And then just like talking to coaches. Again, I would recommend like reaching out to people at clubs where you'll have like more of a chance of potentially breaking in. So um, again, your like local non-league club probably doesn't have any data support. If there's a way where you can reach out to someone who's working at your local non-league club and provide anything, I'm sure that they would be like more open to it than if you're reaching out to someone who's working at like a club in the Premier League. So yeah, I would say that just sort of trying to work on your football knowledge and work with people who are in football will definitely help you.
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned obviously speaking to coaches because when you so without jumping too much around your kind of career so far, so you spent time Opta, Stats Perform, and then also Sport Logic. So two kind of commercial side of things in terms of the data and tech companies. So then that first move into York Nine or York United, was that a bit of a shock for you? Because that's the first time you were actually in-house in a club. So what was different about that, and what did you have to do to kind of adapt to being in that position rather than in a company?
Yeah, well, I guess there's two things. First off, is my experience at York 9 was like very different than I think a lot of people in clubs because it was COVID. So I was there for 2020. And basically during that season we played 7 games. They were all on an island. In like there was basically an island that had very low COVID rates in Canada. And so they played the entire like tournament, which replaced the season on this island there. So I wasn't really ingrained in like the day to day as much. Like I was sending reports from afar. I didn't travel with the team to that tournament. A lot of the work I did was on the recruitment side after in the like 3 or 4 months that followed that tournament.
Yeah,
Um, and so yeah, that work was probably a little different than what it is like to be in a club. But to answer kind of the broader question about whether it was a shock, I actually didn't find it that surprising. And I think it's that experience that I had at the two previous companies.
mm,
I think if you go straight into a club, it definitely is like it's a very different environment to probably the average working environment. But I had seen how so many different clubs operate. So when I was at Opta, when I was at Sportlogic, we would do like training ground visits all the time. I
yeah,
got to know a lot of people who were working at clubs. I got to understand like what was working, what wasn't working. And I think when you're at a club, it's a bit different where like often these people who are working at other clubs are your competitors,
mm,
and so they're potentially like they're not going to maybe open up in the same way. Whereas if they're a client of yours, which was the case for a lot of clubs in the Premier League when I was at Stats Perform, when we go and visit them, they want better services. So they'll tell you, this is what we're working on. These are our difficulties. How can you help us with this? And so yeah, to be honest, I didn't find it like a huge culture shock or anything when I got into a club environment, just because I think I'd had so much exposure to it by the time that I actually made that jump.
yeah, yeah. That's interesting. I mean, one thing that comes to my mind would be when you're in these kind of like the stats perform, for example, you're probably, I would imagine, surrounded by many other data analysts and people with your skill set. But when you go in a club, it might be a big department, but chances are it probably isn't, and you're kind of on your own a bit to fend for yourself and sort problems out without any help.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference is sort of like the external expectations of you.
Hmm.
So like when you're at a tech company that's working in sport, a lot of them will work on like these various kind of tech product pipelines. So like Jira or sprints, which honestly, if you don't know what those words are, you don't need to know. It's basically like tech speak for we want to finish this project within 2 weeks. We want this chunk done within like 3 days. So you break out these big projects into smaller pieces, and almost always your boss will know, okay, this is the job that I've given Sam. He should finish this within 5 days. If it
Yeah,
takes more than 5 days, we need to figure out why. If it takes less than 5 days, that's great.
yeah,
When you're in a club, like you're the only one that actually understands that. So
yeah,
sometimes, like I would find, like my boss would ask for some new feature in our like scouting platform, and I would say like, "Oh yeah, I'll have that to you in like 20 minutes." And they'd be amazed, like, "Oh
yeah,
my God, that's incredible! Like this is such good work. How are you able to do this so quickly?" And then they'll ask for some other feature request, and I'm like, "That's like 5 months of work right there." And then you're
yeah,
like, "Well, that's so much easier than what I just asked you before that took 20 minutes." And so I think that's a big adjustment is like the external expectations of your work. You have to really kind of work to like to make people understand, or at least like let people know how long things are going to take and what the like difficulty level of different projects are. And then the second part is definitely like the self learning. So as you said, when you're at like a tech company, you have all these people around you who are like more technical than you, who like you have like back end engineers who can help with all of the like data engineering side. You have front end engineers who can help like design your web applications and stuff. And you can learn from like the best in class at all these things where you don't really have that at a club. Well, most clubs don't have an analytics department that big. When I started at Miami, it was just me.
mm,
Um, and so you kind of have to do a lot more like self-guided learning. You have to figure out what you're not good at, how you can learn that better.
yeah.
So that's definitely a difference from working at a club versus at a tech company.
Yeah, because I suppose it would be easy to just kind of only do what you're good at, and then that, and obviously you don't grow as an analyst then if you're not challenging yourself and trying new things and kind of at least trying to branch out a little bit. So I'll be honest, I don't know much at all about the Canadian Premier League. So what's like the analytics like compared to from the Canada to the US in terms of the MLS Canadian Premier?
Yeah, so just to kind of give an overview for listeners who aren't kind of familiar with the Canadian Premier League is the top level of like soccer just with Canadian teams,
Mm.
but the best Canadian teams don't play in the Canadian Premier League. So Major League Soccer, which is like the American Soccer League, has Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal all play in that league, and so you do have like it's definitely a much lower league than a much lower quality league than MLS. When I was there, it was, as I said, it was a COVID year, and it was also only the second year of the league. So I was the first ever analytics hire, I believe, in the entire league.
Wow. Yeah.
And it was, yeah, I mean, it was like I was working with a friend of mine who was the sporting director at the time, who I'd worked with before at both SportLogic and Stats Perform. So yeah, it was a very different setup. It was a small group of us working
Mm.
on recruitment, and it was people that you wouldn't typically have like doing recruitment. Like we had our team administrator, who was great. He was like a key member of our recruitment team because it was just a small group of us who were working on this stuff. So when I got to Miami, it was like this is a proper kind of club setup where it's just a way bigger operation. Yeah, like I mean, I don't know quite what kind of analogy I would make, but it would be something like going from I don't know, like conference north team to a championship club, like that sort of jump up. So it was very different.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, we'll get to Miami then, Sam. So, because it's quite an interesting one, because not only are you going in as like to start the analytics department, it's basically a new team at that point. I mean, well, in fact, that was the first question. How old was the team when you joined? Were you right from the start, or?
I was the second year of the team. So basically, the team was founded in 2020, or it was founded. The first season was
Yeah,
2020, which ended up obviously being the COVID year where the team played in front of either in empty stadiums or at this like mid-season tournament that MLS created, which was at Disneyland and came with all sorts of other issues. So the club was like on the field very unsuccessful in its first season.
mm,
And in addition, had some there was a scandal related to like spending. So the team overspent on certain players that wasn't reported. And so there were a bunch of like financial sanctions against the club
yeah,
in the following season. And as a result of that, the front office staff was basically entirely changed. So I came in with a new head coach, new sporting director, new director of recruitment, and we all came in at the start of the second year. But it
mhm,
really didn't feel like a second year. It felt like a kind of a first year, except we all had a squad that at the time was even if we had wanted to keep them into the following year, we couldn't because of these financial sanctions. So we had to shed a bunch of our salary. We had to shed a bunch of the salary cap. So MLS is a salary cap league.
yeah,
And we essentially had about 20% less cap space to use than every other team in the league because of these financial sanctions.
yeah,
So I came in with this new group, and essentially in that first season, we had to get rid of I think we changed out 19 players in our first team squad that first season. So it felt like an expansion year, but except we had to get players out and bring players in at the same time. So yeah, that was a really good experience, and it was I think it was a huge opportunity for us. I think normally when you're in a club, you get to work on like three or four signings a window. In MLS, it's definitely more than that. And
yeah,
then for us, it was, yeah, I mean, we overhauled the entire team.
yeah. So you went in as the only kind of analysis staff member. You mentioned the new sporting director went as well. Was that person? Did you know that person before you joined, or were you both new and you didn't know each other?
No, so yeah, we were both new. It's Chris Henderson, who's still the sporting director there.
Yeah,
And I think one thing that I got very lucky working with Chris Henderson for was that he had previously been at Seattle, who had been one of the most successful teams in MLS.
yeah.
And he had worked with one of the first ever data analysts in MLS in Ravi Ramaneni. So when he arrived at Miami, I think he had a much better sense as a sporting director of like what he wanted from an analytics person from data. And so he was a great person to work with just because he had that experience where not many sporting directors have now, well, now it's becoming more and more common, but have that experience with working with like multiple different data analysts. And so I do think that was like a big bonus with working with Chris is that he had had that previous experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine that helped you settle in as well and feel like you were probably more valued as well, and the work you were doing was useful. So you were there for 3 years, I believe,
Yeah,
Sam.
a
So
little over 3 years. Yeah.
a little over three. So you mentioned obviously you went in as the only one. Did that change? Did the an analytics department grow when you were there? Did you hire other people or did it stick with yourself?
Yeah, so it was two. It was me and one other person when I left. And basically, when I came in, as I said, we were just in this situation where the recruitment was the main thing we needed to work on. We needed to get a bunch of players out and bring a bunch of new players in. So it was 20 players that first season.
Mm.
And then over time, I worked also with at the time, the head coach was Phil Neville and his lead analyst, Alex Scott. We worked really closely on kind of first team analysis. So opposition analysis, post match, own team analysis, just the kind of day-to-day coaching side of it as well. So my work was basically tied up between recruitment and performance analysis.
Yeah.
And then over time, the sports science side kind of became more and more important. So there was a desire to do more on the sports science side. I tried to help out as much as I could. And it kind of became clear at one point that to really support the sports science side, in addition to recruitment and first team analysis, we needed another person. So I brought on another analyst. Her name's Jordan Kaplan. So she's still there.
Mm.
And initially, she worked kind of just on the sports science side. So the idea was we wanted our analytics department to support the whole sporting organization at the club, not just recruitment.
Yeah. And is that what you did your master's in sports science, Sam?
Yeah, so the master's in sports science, it was just research based. It's a thesis, which what I was curious in was basically that exact question was how does we've had all these sports science metrics for so long. Every single club, like at a high level, has a sports science staff, and everyone's wearing GPSs. We're collecting this data every single training session. Um, and now clubs are hiring these like analytics people for basically entirely different roles for the most part. It's typically to work on recruitment and analysis. Um, and I just think that with all this data that we have and all of the sort of effect that you can have on the athletes from a sports science side, we should be doing more to like bring these two worlds together.
Mm.
So my master's thesis was basically looking at ways that we can take analytics metrics and sports science metrics and use them to help contextualize each other. So rather than just saying this player generated like 20% goal value on this run. So they increased the value of the team scoring by like 3%,
Yeah.
which is what we'd see on the like analytics side. And what you'd see on the sports science side is this player had one high intensity run during like this period, right?
Yeah.
Is can we take these two together and like add more context to both sides? So can we help inform what a player is doing tactically by understanding their physical capabilities, like using things like top speed, distance run to help inform what the player can actually provide us tactically,
Mm.
and vice versa, use the tactical to kind of inform what are the physical demands of this game going to be based on what we expect the tactical framework of this game to be. So I think there's a ton that these two fields can learn from each other, and it's an area that I'm like super passionate about.
Yeah. Cool. So during that, and I think this was maybe also from the Stats Bomb presentation that I watched, Sam. So you mentioned kind of tracking data. So you got tracking data through the league, I believe. So you had that in terms of that was part of the analytics you would do. Can you just kind of maybe riff on that a little bit in terms of how you know what kind of data, a little bit more on tracking data for those watching, maybe what kind of data is given to you and what you actually do with that and what insights you can get from that.
Yeah, so if you look at like basically we divide data for the most part in the analytics world into event data and tracking data. So event data is companies like Y Scouts, StatsBomb, StatsPerform, all provide event data.
Yeah.
And this is basically like every on-ball event. So you'll, depending on the provider, you'll get between like 1,500 and 3,000 events per game. And so this is every pass that a player makes, where it happened, every tackle, every shot, every interception. And so if you ever see these like sequence maps on Twitter or wherever, you'll see like, oh, this player had the ball here, then they passed it here, then maybe they dribbled here, and then they passed it here. So it's like a line, and you only follow the ball.
Mm.
Uh, which obviously gives you a ton of information, but it's missing the context of what are the other options the player had? What was the opposition doing at this time? It's missing that like broader context. So with tracking data, you get the location of every single player somewhere between like 25 and 30 times per second. So you're going from a data set where you have, as I said, between 1,500 and 3,000, like kind of rows of data in a traditional sense of the word, to close to 4 million. So it's a way, way richer data set. But at the same time, it's harder to use because you have so much more information. And you also sometimes don't have those key actions. So really, like often the actions we care the most about are those like on-ball actions, passes, shots. So the way that like I've approached the problem of using tracking data, and I know a lot of people have, is to often just to like add context to the events that we already have. So if we're making a pass, I want to know how many passing options does that player have? I want to know, did the pass break a line? Did they play through the line? Did they play around the line? Was how much pressure was on the player making the pass? And then also looking at what's happening again off the ball with his teammates. So did you have a teammate making a run in behind? Did he see that run in behind? So all these things we can start to analyze with tracking data. And so that's sort of the first way that tracking data is used, is to like augment event data. And then the second way, which you see more and more of now, are these like continuous possession value models. So understanding things like what is the actual probability of scoring from any situation.
Yeah.
And you can approximate that with event data, but really without understanding the context of the opposition, it's a difficult challenge.
Okay, so if you've made it this far into the video, you must be enjoying the content. Either that or you have simply fallen asleep. So whichever one of them it is, you probably won't mind me asking you for a quick favour. So as you know, I'm always looking to grow the channel. So the bigger the channel gets, the more people we can reach and impact, but also the bigger and better guests we can invite onto the channel to have these types of chats. So with that in mind, if you haven't already done so, I would very much appreciate it if you did hit the subscribe button down below the video. The stats are showing around 25% of viewers are subscribed. So there's a big chunk of you that are watching the videos, but you haven't yet hit the subscribe button, but I will let you off because you can do it right now. It's free and it literally takes 1 second. So if you go down, click the subscribe button, it would mean a lot to the channel and help the channel to grow. So that's all for now. Let's get back to the video. Yeah. So I think I've seen you've mentioned before in terms of with the tracking data, so say obviously the X and Y coordinates, you can then kind of define different events, such as you mentioned off the ball run, so like an overlap, or you can define kind of what pressure looks like from the tracking data. So can you just go a bit more on that, Sam, in terms of like, for example, pressure, how do you define pressure based on the tracking data?
Yeah, so typically, like there's some companies, for example, that now will say when like a player is applying pressure. So if I'm on the ball and you come and close me down, they'll say, okay, Chris made one pressure here. So in the same way that it was like an on-ball action, you could say, yeah, you made a pressure here. And then maybe we could assign some value to you based on what I do. So if I then play a pass out into touch, you would have a successful pressure because your pressure forced me into a poor decision where we lost the ball. So that's like one way of looking at pressure, which is more of kind of the event data way. And then in the tracking data way, we can think of pressure as this continuous thing. So if you're applying pressure to me kind of head on, so if you're running towards me as I have the ball, that's one type of pressure. But say that all you're doing is cutting off my passing angle. So if I'm like, let's say I'm a left center back, and your goal as the pressing player in the situation was only to remove that option for me to play a cross-field pass to the right, to the right back, basically. So you stand there, you've cut off that passing angle, and then there's another player who comes in and provides pressure on the ball. So if from an event data standpoint, you would say, okay, first pass is under pressure, second pass is under pressure. But this second one, you've cut off a passing angle by pressuring me from one side, and then there's another player coming to deliver pressure. We can now assign that using tracking data. We can assign that a value between 0 and 1 or whatever pressing scale you want to use. We can identify that that's a very different type of pressure than just you coming towards me with the ball, or when I have the ball. So with tracking data, we can get into a bit more of those nuances, and we don't have to consider pressure like a binary thing, that you're under pressure or not under pressure.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. I'll link another video because I did watch it. I don't know which one it was, but on YouTube you were talking more about that. So I will link that below as well for anyone that wants to hear a little bit more. So what I'd like to ask you about now, Sam, is kind of delivering insights to different decision makers, and also kind of in that question like non-data people, so coaches that maybe, you mentioned earlier about the languages that data analysts can maybe use too much of in terms of how does it look, how does your role as a data analyst differ if you're delivering to a coach, to a sporting director, to a head of recruitment?
Yeah, I think it has to do with both the different positions that you just mentioned, but also just the different people and personalities. So,
Mm.
I think one thing that's sort of impossible to avoid that everyone goes through at one point or another in their career is that you like build up a language for a coaching staff,
Mm.
and eventually a coaching staff's change,
Yeah.
and I guarantee you the next coaching staff will not have the same language. So I think there's something to be said about just like understanding the person, building up relationships with the people, and then figuring out what do they value, what's most important to them. Maybe your process is the same regardless of who you're delivering to. So if I'm doing an analysis of a player, um, for our head coach versus a sporting director versus our director of recruitment, probably the things that I would look at would be the exact same, but then I might present that in three different ways. So when I was at Miami, a big part of my role was obviously working on the recruitment side, as I said. So providing information on the player to our director of recruitment, to our sporting director, to try and the head coach to try and give as much information as I can about the player. Then once we get into the kind of more, once we're closer to signing that player, then we need the money. And so then presentation goes to ownership. So at that point, it has to be very different because at that point you're not saying to say to a head coach, oh, you should want this player because they're going to help you play the style of play you want to play. They're going to help you improve X, Y, Z. That's one sell. But when you're selling to the ownership group, it's different because then you're saying, I need to make the case that from a financial standpoint, this player is worth the investment and this player will help our team. So a lot of it has to do with just understanding who you're pitching to, both from a role perspective, but also a personality perspective.
Mm.
And I would say one thing that's very different about being at US Soccer is that now instead of working with one head coach, I'm working with a lot. And so what terminology, like the terminology that Greg Berhalter uses will be different than the terminology, sorry, our men's national team coach, Greg Berhalter uses will be different than the terminology our women's national team coach, Emma Hayes uses. So it's figuring out, okay, maybe we have this post-match report that is similar for both teams,
Mm.
but for this coach, I want to change the language a little bit here. For this coach, I want to change the language a little bit here. Maybe some of the zones that we're interested in getting in are a bit different just based on the game model of that coach. And so I think it's really about understanding what the person that you're speaking to values, kind of trying to understand them as a person, how they take this information in, and then making sure it's as relevant as possible to them. So it feels like something you've built for them, even if it's something you've only just tweaked a little bit for multiple people.
Yeah. Yeah. When you just going back to Miami, so actually, so obviously you went in as a data analyst. How integrated were you with like the video analyst? Were you like, just want to ask you about that kind of because you mentioned right at the start where you said you read Moneyball. I'm sure a lot of people have seen the film, and it's kind of the character in that, that is kind of not welcomed by a lot of the old time scouts and stuff like that. Obviously, it's not really like that anymore as much, but just in terms of that's important to be able to integrate and be seen as your doors open to them different kind of coaches and stuff like that. So just kind of wanted to ask you about that in terms of how close were you to the other members of the coaching staff, really?
Yeah, I would say like we had a pretty close relationship. Again, it's mostly most of my interaction with the coaching staff tends to be like with the video analysts for pre and post match work. So I found like when I was at Miami during the transfer windows, that's when the head coach becomes really interested in the recruitment side because that's when they can actually help to inform those decisions. A lot of that work from the recruitment side obviously happens before we get to a transfer window, and then it's when the coach becomes more involved, making sure that we have a lot of options for them.
Yeah.
But on the first team analysis side, I think working with the video analyst is like the most important way to get your message across. These are often people that are handpicked by the head coach. So they're people who the coach really trusts.
Yeah.
And I think analytics, especially like in the roles that I've been in, I've been more of like a club person. So when coaching staffs changed, I stayed, but the like analyst would often change because new coach has a new analyst they work with. And so building that relationship with the video analyst, I think like is one of the most important parts of the role because that is typically the person that the head coach trusts the most, who you can help present your information with.
Yeah.
And performance analysts tend to be like relatively data savvy. I've had the like opportunity to work with a lot of like really good video analysts who understand the data side of things and are really good at helping present that information. And a lot of the time, it's just about having a discussion and figuring out what is the best way to present this information to the head coach, because sometimes that is video, or sometimes that is just data. Sometimes it's data and video, and sometimes it's just video. I can think of examples where like I've had a chart of something that I say, okay, this is a really important, like this came up in an analysis of a team. This is a really important thing that I've noticed. And then we'll say, okay, let's just watch the video and we'll watch this same thing happen like 7 times. And so we came to that conclusion from the data because we saw, okay, we see this thing happening in the data, but we see it so clearly when we watch the video. And we probably wouldn't have come to that. We might not have come to that conclusion if we hadn't had the data. But now that we show the video clips like 7 in a row, let's just show the video clips rather than showing this data, like which doesn't make the point as clearly. So I think a lot of that collaboration is just figuring out, again, how to communicate the information you want to communicate.
Yeah. Yeah, again, I'm just referring again back to the stats one presentation. I might butcher this quote, but you said something along the lines of this, Sam. So if you work within a club in analytics, you are much an educator as you are the person that's doing the analysis. So again, I think that's kind of on that same topic of those non-data people that you might have to work with. You need to make it as easy as you can for them to understand what you're actually doing.
Yeah, and I think also, I know I said this in that stats bomb presentation as well, that analytics is kind of one of the only major departments in on the sporting side that actually has zero decision-making power on its own.
Yeah,
So, like, if you're a sports scientist, or if you're like if you're working on the performance side, let's say you're like an S&C coach or something, you might set the warm up. Sure, you'll communicate with the head coach to make sure you're on the same page. But really, you've made that decision what the warm up today is going to be, and you execute that. If you're the head coach or you're an assistant coach, you're helping decide what are the tactics going to be, which team are we going to start. Same thing with sporting director, you're deciding players that we bring in. Analytics, like I don't have any
yeah,
decision making power on my own.
mm,
The way that I can help influence decisions is exactly that, like helping influence people. And so a lot of it is educating those decision makers and then giving them the information where they can come to those conclusions themselves. So like I always want to be part of those discussions. I want to be in those rooms where recruitment decisions are being made, where we're discussing what tactical approaches we want to like implement or whatever. But I also want to be in a situation where I can give that information to someone else and I can trust them to go make the right decision from the information that I've provided or make an informed decision from the information I've provided.
yeah. Yeah, makes sense, definitely. So another quote, Sam, that I've got from a talk that you've done. So, build tools with users in mind. Tools are always a better solution to answers. So, can you just expand a little bit on that, please?
Yeah, I think it's similar to the point I was just making, where it's like if you have a tool where you can kind of uncover an answer, you'll
Mm,
feel more ownership over that answer. So if I say like, okay, this weekend we're playing X, so like our first game in the Copa America is against Bolivia in a week and a half.
yeah,
If I said, okay, here is the data on Bolivia, and because of that, we should play this formation, and this should be the starting 11. Uh, I mean, the head coach is not going to listen to me. I'm the data guy, and I've just told him this is what I think the starting 11 should be. Just clearly, as I said, like not my purview.
yeah,
If I can build a tool where he can see, okay, what are and a tool doesn't have to necessarily be something interactive. I think we often think of tools as being like web apps, which I'm like a big fan of web apps. I think if you can make anything web based for a coaching staff or for yeah, decision maker, that's really helpful. But a
mm,
tool can just be like a regular automated post-match report they can look, or an opposition report that they can look at and say, oh, you know what? Looking at Bolivia, this is a weakness we've noticed, and kind of allow them to come to that decision, which might be the same decision that I would say if I just gave them a report and said, like, this
yeah,
is what I think you should do. They're obviously coming from a more informed place because they've done more than just looked at a data report, but helping them like feel an ownership over the decision. And it's the same thing in recruitment. Whereas if you can build a tool where it's like um, the director of recruitment can go and analyze a player using data himself, and then he comes to me and says, "Oh, using data, I actually found this great player." Um, and that happened a lot at Miami, where it was our director of recruitment who was using tools that I built and he would identify players with data that I hadn't noticed or I hadn't like looked for yet. And that's really cool because he feels a sense of ownership over it and that he's found the player. I haven't found the player. I haven't really done anything on the player. But it's with a tool that I've built. And so we both kind of feel this like joint sense of ownership. And I think that's one thing I felt like we did really well at Miami is when we did make recruitment decisions, it really felt like a team decision. Like it often felt like the head coach had input, I had input, recruitment had input, sporting director had input, the scouts had input. Like it really felt like we have all these sources of information, we're bringing them together, and it's a decision that we've made as a team.
Yeah, cool. Nice. So we'll get a little bit technical, not too much, but I know some people might want to hear this because again, I've heard you speak about focusing on building out infrastructure, and it was also the Statsman conference. You kind of mentioned, and some of this is over my head, Sam. So please forgive me if I ask stupid questions, but I'm curious to ask you for people listening that might want to hear. So you mentioned a PostgreSQL database, which was stored on Amazon, a web app built in Django and stored on Elastic Beanstalk, Python, R was listed. So I'm just curious to ask you about the tools you used and a little bit more if you can expand on some of them if possible.
Yeah, so I mean, taking this from like the point of view of starting from scratch, which again has been a big difference from me coming into U.S. soccer. Like I'm not the first data person at U.S. soccer.
Mm.
There's been some great data people in the past. Joris Beckers and Kevin Shank have been at U.S. soccer for like 6 years now, I think, 4 and 6 years, something like that. And so they've built out a lot of great infrastructure. So I think like it's different when you come in and you sort of the goal is to then figure out how you can fit into it. But if speaking from a Miami experience where there was nothing, I would say like the number one thing is you need to like understand a coding language and start to build out in that coding language. So that would be R or Python are like the main two. I mean, there's others, but those are, I would say, what
Yeah.
probably 99% of analysts in football use right now.
Mhm.
And then the other thing that I would say is like from there, you want to store all your data in a database. So Postgres is what I used at Miami. There's Redshift databases, there's MySQL databases, there's a ton of different options for databases.
Mm.
But I think what's really important with a database that you don't necessarily get if you're just pulling data from APIs is things are like repeatable. Like you have that data, you have the outputs of your models of whatever stored, and it's easily accessible. So to me, like the two number one building blocks are A, coding language, and then B, a database. And so, as I said, I stored mine on AWS. There's a bunch of different options. There's AWS, there's like Google Cloud Infrastructure, there's Microsoft Azure. There's a ton of options of how to store it. But basically, those are the two main building blocks. And then in terms of like web applications, again, there's a ton. So like as I mentioned at Miami, I used Django, which is like a Python kind of interface. I know a lot of people use like our Shiny apps.
Mm.
Um, there's people who use like apps that are built with kind of off-the-shelf data visualization tools, so Power BI, Tableau. And again, the whole idea with this is you don't want to be the gatekeeper of data. If you start to build out these like web apps,
Mm.
then other people can use data without understanding any SQL or R or Python. So yeah, I would say those are kind of the three main building blocks.
Mm.
And then the way that you approach it is related to however you feel most comfortable doing that or based on what the infrastructure is there. So I don't think there's like necessarily a right one from all of these like buckets to choose from. But if you have that basic infrastructure of coding language, database, and front end or web app, I think you'll be set.
Yeah, perfect. So we'll get on to a little bit more now on US soccer. So obviously your current role, Sam, not been there too long. How long has it been?
Yeah, about 3 months now.
About 3 months. Okay, perfect. So where are you actually based to do that? Where about?
So I'm based in Chicago right now,
Mm.
but we are moving to Atlanta within the next year, 2 years.
Okay, cool. And so would that be the whole US data analytics team together in Atlanta, or still some remote, or how does that look?
Yeah, we'll all be together in Atlanta. Yeah, so the idea is that the Federation is building a new national training facility, so similar to like what you would have in the UK at St. George's Park,
Yeah.
or England, I should say. And so the idea is that we, as US Soccer, like right now, we're in an office building in downtown Chicago, which isn't super conducive to like running a national environment, like a kind of pro soccer environment, right? It's we want to be on the grass, we want to be like with players as often as possible. And so with a national training center, we'll be able to like host most of our camps in Atlanta. We'll have like more exposure to players. We'll be able to like host more, do more. It's difficult like traveling. I was just traveling with our women's national team, and we spend like you spend a couple days in one location. We were in Denver at a training at a college for a few days, and then go up to Minnesota. And so like it's just sort of the idea is that we want like a central hub again, similar to what the FA have
Yeah.
with St. George's Park. So that is where US soccer is moving, but right now we're in this sort of interim stage.
Yeah, perfect. And I've seen recently, obviously, there's been a few jobs posted, so I presume you're kind of building out a department, whether you've hired some or you may be hiring some more. So, how do you go about doing that, Sam, in terms of knowing what you need and how much resource you need and how many, data analysts you need, engineers, or different roles within the data sphere? How do you kind of manage that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's something that really excited me about US soccer is that there are these resources to like build out a much bigger team than I think I could have had at an MLS club. And so it's something, especially as we build toward the 2026 and 2027 World Cups, we
Hmm.
really want to build out like a strong data analytics team. And right now, I think a lot of it is just sort of observe, figure out where you think blind spots are. So the first two roles I posted were a data engineer and a data analyst. Which I think are kind of pretty standard roles. If you're thinking about like building out a department, those are pretty standard. As I said, we do have people working on the data side at US Soccer already.
Yeah.
They're working in like slightly different roles than the purely like kind of day-to-day national team side of data analytics.
Hmm.
And so with the data engineer, it's obviously I've just gone through all the infrastructure that you would want. And that's a huge project. It was a huge project at a club. At a federation, it's just such a bigger project because there's so much more data. And then with the data analyst, again, it's being able to answer those questions quickly, to build up these tools, to make sure that the coaches have what they need. There's always going to be ad hoc questions. There's always going to be things that come up.
Yeah.
And the time pressure at a federation, I'm starting to learn, is much there's times when the time pressure is much lower because you go through 3 weeks, or you'll go longer than that. You'll go through months without a game for a national team. And then suddenly you're in camp for a week and a half and things need to be immediate
Hmm.
because coaches are spending so much time together. You want to make the most of every single moment that you have with players in camp. And so you really have to be able to work on your toes in the national team environment because the timelines are so quick.
Yeah. So I'm just interested to ask you a bit more about kind of the other personnel with it. So who's your boss, Sam? Who do you report to, and how does that look?
Yeah, so I report into the director of high performance at US Soccer, who's Rick Cost.
Hmm.
So the way that US Soccer is set up is basically we have our technical staff, which is the coach, just the coaches,
Yeah.
and then everyone else who works on a sporting environment basically reports into high performance. So we have a sports science department, medical department, data analytics department, sporting analytics department,
Hmm.
and a research and innovation department. So those five departments all, and sporting analytics, for those who don't know, is sort of like our video or performance analysis. So those five departments all report into our yeah director of high performance.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So, and then in terms of, you mentioned right at the start, like all the different teams. So obviously the men's, the women's, the other teams as well. In terms of obviously the youth team. So I'm just curious to ask you, what age group are you actually able to collect data from when you look at the younger I was going to say English teams, the US teams? Can you go really low? How does that look in terms of data collection?
Yeah, I mean, we collect data on every single one of our camps. So we have analysts who are in camp, like performance analysts who are coding games, who are yeah, recording video, collecting data. We have sports science who are collecting GPS data. So yeah, I don't think there's really like a limit. And this is kind of gets back to this point that I was making earlier, where I think if you have access to like a local non-league team or something, there's no real like lowest level where you can collect data. If you want to go like to like your younger siblings game and collect data on your younger siblings game, you can do it, right? There's not like a there's no lowest level where like you can collect data. So I think there's always obviously as we get more and more senior, there's more data that we have. For example, like once we get to our senior teams, for example, we have data from their club environments. Whereas like at US soccer, we're not necessarily going to have data from the club environments of our U15 players.
Yeah.
And so there's obviously differences, but I do think you can get data at every level.
Yeah. Definitely. So now you're in kind of a more of a senior position then, Sam. Obviously, I know your role may change as the department grows out, but and I suppose it isn't really an average day. But are you finding that you don't do as much analytics like that, the actual analysis, and you're more managing people now, or do you still get your hands dirty and you're still kind of doing bits and pieces?
Yeah, it's definitely both. I mean, this is a more senior role where I have a bigger team that I'm managing. And so obviously there's more on the management side, which I think is something that for me personally, that's an area I want to grow in, an area where I want to learn and like understand how to be a better manager of people. But there still is definitely time when I'm, yeah, getting into the data weeds. Right now, again, we have a lot of major tournaments coming up. We have the Copa America for the men, the Olympics for the women, and our men's under 23 team. So there's a lot of like requests coming in, and there's a lot of, yeah, I'm doing a lot of work supporting them both from a management point of view, but also from a like getting dirty with the data kind of thing.
So I'm just curious to ask Sam, like, how much of the time is split between like longer term projects and building things out that you want to do as a data team, but then there's requests that you mentioned, so things coming in from the technical staff and stuff. How do you balance your time to manage that both get done accordingly?
Yeah, I think right now you're asking at a time where we're going into a
Yeah.
summer with three major tournaments. So right now, like the focus is very much on the present.
Mm.
But we really do want to push towards, again, like so much of US soccer, we talk about that 26 men's World Cup and that 27 women's World Cup. Those are major focuses. So once we're kind of through the hurdle of this summer, I think there'll be more time to kind of I'll be able to answer that question better about how I want to split my time between the long term and the short term.
Yeah, definitely. So, I want to ask you now, then, Sam, about kind of looking ahead in the world of football, soccer analytics, in terms of any predictions you might have, or what's exciting you at the minute. Anything that the average viewer might, listener might not know about that is quite interesting. That's kind of going on in the space.
Yeah, as I mentioned, like I think a lot of analytics in the past, well, and the present right now is focusing on recruitment and analysis,
Mm.
which I think are areas where there's so much still room to grow and like there's so much more we can do. If I was like an owner of a club and tomorrow I had to make my first analytics hire, I would hire someone to work on recruitment because I think that's where the biggest gains can be made.
Mm.
But that being said, I think the area of growth that is going to be most exciting is the kind of sports science and I almost want to say player development area.
Yeah.
So as we get more data on like younger players through the academy and understand these players more as like as athletes that are developing into we want to develop better players. It's not just about this player is this good and that's the level they're going to be at. The players that are already in our environment, how do we develop these players into better players?
Mm.
And again, I think that's closely tied to sports science because it's the idea of what are their physical capabilities? How can we develop their physical, technical, tactical capabilities? How can we just improve them as athletes overall? And so I think that's really the area of analytics that I'm most interested in going forward is like how this field helps to support player development.
Yeah. Yeah, because it kind of, you mentioned obviously recruitment is what normally gets the most focus because that's kind of the quicker wins. Like you need the results, you need the players to hit the first team, and obviously the academy is something that probably wrongly is overlooked because it is more of a longer term, and the people, that might take several years to see results and see the impact of the kind of work. So it's kind of, yeah, I agree. It's a very interesting area that the analytics can be applied to. So in terms of, I want to ask you if you where does AI, ChatGPT, etc., fit into your workflow? Are you using that on a day-to-day basis, or how do you see that might improve the workflow of analysts over time?
Yeah, I use AI and ChatGPT basically just to answer coding questions. So when I get stalled, I'll throw it into ChatGPT, which I would say is pretty normal for most people in my roles. Like I think right now it's at this stage where it's helpful on the like coding side.
Hmm.
Um, I think you're starting to see David Sumter's companies, like I think the first example of this 12 that is starting to look at like how we use AI to generate scouting reports, to generate like uh, basically to put data in a more qualitative
Yeah,
setting. So if
yeah,
someone doesn't know how to read data, can we like spit it out as a text like report that someone might be more familiar with reading? So I think that's a direction that things are going in. I don't think they're quite there yet. I
mm,
think if you talk to people at clubs, what they're typically doing is using it to help them with their like day-to-day coding problems.
yeah. Yeah, you mentioned obviously, so David Sumter's been on the channel. Again, link that because he does give a demo in that episode. So if anyone's interested to see that in action in terms of how it works, you can check that out. So we've obviously touched upon a lot of advice throughout the conversation so far, Sam. I'll just go back 'cause I just want to ask a few more bits and pieces which I think a lot of viewers might find useful. So more specifically on interviews. So you mentioned you're hiring people, you're building a department. So can you give any advice for people maybe going for their first interview at a club setting? You know, what they might expect in that situation, what they can do to maybe improve their chances?
Yeah, I would say it's probably not like this is probably generic interview advice. It's not necessarily tailored necessarily to working at a club. But do your research beforehand, like understand the club, understand if you know who you're going to be interviewing with, just Google them, figure out what these people's roles are, how they fit in with the club. Understand this might seem obvious, but like who the players are at the club, like basic things like that, I think can go a long way, just to see me a little more prepared. Often these interviews involve like a task. And so I think with that, it's you basically you have to know your stuff. You have to be able to like to code, you have to be able to put something together. But I think a lot of it just has to do with like research, feel comfortable be like if you're in that environment and you've done your research, you understand the club, I think you'll be naturally more confident than if you're just going into it as, oh, I've applied to 500 jobs in football. I can't remember if this one is Barnsley or
Yeah.
Burnley today. Like, I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely, definitely. So, again, right at the start, we spoke about kind of sending messages and networking with people kind of on that journey with you in similar roles to learn from them. I want to ask a little bit about kind of networking face to face, and it leads on to the Soccer Insight Summit, which you
Yeah.
are kind of doing so early next year. So, I don't know when this video is going to come out, but I've done one also with Sarah Rudd, so that might come out first as well.
Okay.
So we bring it up a little bit in there as well. But if you can just expand on that a little bit, Sam. So what is that? How did that come about? And why are you looking forward to doing something like that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of major conferences in Europe that I think are really good for analytics. And um, I think part of what makes them so good is not just that the presentations are good and that there's a high quality of speaker, but that it's just a great opportunity to get together with other analysts. For me, when I was first breaking in, I found these conferences a really good way to just like meet the people whose jobs I'd love to have, to network, to like have a couple of drinks with these people. And so I think these conferences are invaluable. And there's always been good options for them in Europe. I mean, the StatsBomb conference, the OptaPro Forum have been like kind of the classics. And in the US, we had a very good one, which I've already mentioned Ravi on this podcast, but he used to run a Sounders Analytics Conference when he was working at the Seattle Sounders, which was sort of this, I would say, the central like soccer analytics conference in the US.
Yeah,
Since Ravi has left Seattle, there's been this gap, and I actually often get asked by vendors who are trying to sell to like clubs, where can I go and meet like
yeah,
80% of MLS clubs? And there's not really been a place. And so it was one where having worked at a club for a long time, or been in this environment, like it's you don't really have the time to put aside however much of your day to like organize a conference. So when Scott Powers from Rice University approached myself, Ravi, and Sarah and said basically, Rice University will handle, which is based in Houston, will handle the logistics of this conference.
yeah,
If you guys can go get speakers, invite people you know, it was a great opportunity because all three of us had kind of been like, we really wanted a conference like this, and we want an opportunity to meet up and coming students who are working in this field, but also just to like interact with our peers in person rather than just over Zoom or on calls and texts.
yeah,
And so the opportunity to organize this came up. Yeah, Scott has been great putting this together. And so yeah, I'm really excited for I think you sort of teased it a bit, but it's the Americans Soccer Insight Summit. It'll be in Houston, Texas from January 31st to February 1st this year. If you can make it, we'd love to have as many people there as possible. So yeah, you could check it out online. If you include the website in
yeah.
the description, that would be great. But yeah, I'm really excited about it. And I think we're gonna have some great speakers. I Can't say any names yet, but we're hoping to have some like sporting director level speakers there. So I think it'll be a really good conference.
Nice. Yeah, I'll link all that information below because I think there is a questionnaire as well, which are kind of allowing people to potentially mold what kind of goes on, what people want to see, what people want to hear. So, yeah, click the link down below and register your interest for that because I'm sure that will be a great event. So, what I will basically, I'm through pretty much everything that I wanted to ask you, Sam. But what I do always ask everyone on that comes on the channel is, do you have any recommendations for any books, podcasts? Doesn't have to be sports analytics. Anything that you've consumed that you enjoyed, and you think maybe other people will do so as well.
Yeah, I do think I was thinking about this. I've got my bookshelf right behind me, and I was looking through, trying to see if there's anything that stands out. I think there's some that you've definitely like. I know Tom recommended this, and I'm sure you'll have other people recommend, but like Thinking Fast and Slow or The Undoing Project, I think those are really good books in terms of just understanding how like biases affect people and how you can use things like data and objective information to kind of challenge these biases, understand the biases you see in yourself. So I think there's like a big overlap between analytics and behavioral economics. So yeah, those type of books I'd always recommend. I also think that like if you're going into an environment, understanding that environment is and the history of that environment is super useful. So if anyone is working at an MLS club, I would highly, highly recommend reading The Beckham Experiment by the late Grant Wall,
Yeah.
which is like it's an excellent book of kind of showing what MLS was in 2007 when David Beckham first arrived. And I think it just shows it kind of gives a history of where the league has come from. And so I think understanding those things, I mean, there's plenty of great books on like history of like football history. Some recent good ones, the Michael Cox books, I've really enjoyed the mixer and zonal marking if you want like a history of kind of more recent European football. But yeah, I mean, I'm a big advocate of just trying to learn as much about a field as you can. And so if you get into this environment, I think it's always good if you can learn a bit about the history and what's come before.
Yeah, definitely. Perfect. Well, I'll link them down below as well. So, before I let you go, Sam, we are record. I don't know when this video is going to go out, but we're recording this on the first day of Euro 2024. See after this, Germany v Scotland. So I'm going to ask you your prediction. Who's going to win the Euros? Who's going to win the Copa America?
I think based on my current role, I probably shouldn't make a prediction on the Copa America. Uh, but for the Euros, I think this is like a bad prediction because I don't think they're going to win. But looking talent wise, I think England probably does have the strongest team at the World Cup or at the Euros. France is probably a close second. So yeah, with major trepidation, I'll say England.
Oh, I didn't expect you to say that. So that's cool. Hope you are correct. Perfect. Well, that's everything from me, Sam. Anything else you want to give a shout out to? Anything at all before we wrap it up?
No, I mean, I really appreciate you having me on. Yeah, I guess one more time, if you're in the US or if you want to travel to the US for this conference, I would really recommend checking out the American Soccer Insight Summit. We're really excited about it. So, yeah, and thanks
Amazing.
again for having me on.
No, thanks very much for your time, Sam, and hopefully catch you soon.